Species. Unite.
And I think you could probably go back and track, like, the stages of grief probably that I went through. But I think if you do it right, you end up at acceptance. And that's where I ended up. And that's not to say that I've fully accepted the idea that the golden toad is extinct. Personally, I do still hold out hope that it could still be out there in those forests.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. This conversation is with Trevor Ritland, co-author, along with his twin brother Kyle, of The Golden Toad. The Golden Toad is about a beautiful journey that he and Kyle took into the heart of one of the biggest extinction mysteries of our lifetime. This was in the cloud forest of Costa Rica, where hundreds of golden toads once emerged for a brief few weeks each year. And then suddenly, they were gone, vanished. Trevor and Kyle set out to unravel the mystery. What started out as a search for a lost species became something much deeper, a reckoning with ecological grief, a meditation on hope, and a call to protect what's still here. Hi, Trevor. It is really good to see you, and thank you so much for doing this today.
Happy to be here, Elizabeth. Thanks so much for having me.
So we're here to talk about your book called The Golden Toad. I read it. I loved it. Will you just give a background, like what it's about?
Yeah, for sure. So The Golden Toad revolves around the golden toad, this species from Monteverde, Costa Rica, an endemic toad species that was found nowhere else but this one little ridgetop elfin forest habitat in tropical cloud forest, Costa Rica. It was discovered in 1964, or described by science in 1964. Bright orange toad that was underground for most of the year and kind of came out and appeared with the advent of the spring rains every season and would appear in hundreds, like this massive explosive breeding of these bright orange toads. And then they'd kind of disappear again, and it was like a yearly occurrence. And then kind of from one year to the next, they disappeared. And now looking back, we know that the golden toad is sort of this puzzle piece in a larger amphibian decline that kind of kicked off at the end of the 1980s and is sort of still unraveling. But what's also interesting about the story of the golden toad is the close connection that it had to this community. It's unique to this one area, and sort of the environmental factors at play that contributed to its decline. And so for a long time, scientists weren't really sure what happened to this toad. And so that's one of the things that we explore. And it brought us into, complexities around the mechanisms of disease and climate change and how climate change can impact these fragile ecosystems. But it's also sort of an examination of environmental grief and trying to balance those ideas of grief for what we've lost versus hope for what's still here and what might still be here. And that's probably the most intriguing thing about the story of the golden toad is the idea that it might still be out there somewhere in those cloud forests of Costa Rica.
Most people have never heard of the golden toad, but you had been hearing about it since you were a little kid. Will you talk about your dad and how you knew about it?
So my dad is a biologist. Both my parents are biologists, science people. My mom taught middle school science for years and years, and my dad taught biology at the college level. And he had done, I think the reason he liked teaching so much is because he got to tell stories. And our mom was probably sick of hearing the stories that he would tell over and over again, but he got a new batch of students every year in his classroom, so that was great. But he also had us as an audience, me and my twin brother, Kyle, and so he told us all sorts of crazy stories about his travels and his field work growing up. But one story that stuck with us was a story he brought back from Costa Rica. It was the story of the golden toad, and he had gone there to visit friends of his that he'd made in grad school, and they had taken him up into the places where the golden toads appeared, and he didn't see any on his trip. The kind of season was wrong. They had missed him by just a few weeks, but he told us when we were 6 or 7 the story of the golden toad. And of course, by that time, I mean, this would have been like 98, 99, the story ended with, and the golden toad is gone and nobody's seen it for, 10 years. And I think that might have been part of the thing that intrigued me the most beyond just, the image of this toad, which if you look at an image of this toad, I challenge you to not be enthralled by it. It's so cool. But I think when you're told a story of here's this awesome species and here's all the things about it that's unique and it's gone and you're never going to get to see it, sorry. Like that sort of thing, I think sticks with you. And so that story had been rattling around in my brain. It's not something I thought about every day, but it was kind of always, it was there in the back of my head. And then through a series of fortunate events, I found myself after college living in Monteverde, Costa Rica, which was the town that this toad was known to, and started to hear kind of the local version of the story and begin to get a little bit more intrigued by it.
Well, and you hear often, like with certain species, when they were discovered by scientists or known to science, versus you don't very often hear when they were first seen or the stories behind them. Talk about that a little bit and some of the differences in like the story you knew and the scientific story of the golden toad versus the people.
Here's the simple story. The golden toad was discovered in 1964 by a United States biologist named Jay Savage. Marty Crump, another United States biologist, observed the decline of the golden toad and saw the last golden toad in 1989. And there hasn't been a confirmed sighting of a golden toad since. That's the story as it was told to me. And, that's the story as it's reported in most college textbooks or when it's kind of offered as an example in ecological stories. As these stories get told, they get simplified. And the story is more complex and the local knowledge, I think, is super key. And so I wanted to answer some of those questions. Who saw the last golden toad? It was actually Marty Crump's graduate student named Frank Hensley who saw the last golden toad on the Brigante Ridgeline in 1989 and actually took the last photo ever taken of a golden toad, which is included in the book. We're really excited to share that photo for the first time. But then, just to make things more complex, you start to hear the local version is, I was standing in a cabin in Peñas Blancas in the Atlantic slope of the Cordillera Tiburon, and somebody points to the guy walking by the door, and they go, "That's the guy who saw the last golden toad." Right? I thought that was Frank Hensley. That's not Frank Hensley. It's this local guy named Eladio Cruz who has this story of, he's a farmer turned naturalist, one of these great examples of somebody who was raised as a farmer and then started to conserve his land and work with local conservation organizations, teach himself all sorts of things about the local plants and animals, and now is like the most knowledgeable guy on the planet about Monteverde, ecology and natural history. And he was on a plant survey in 1991, farther out along the Continental Divide, and saw golden toads in 1991. Males, females, a whole bunch of juveniles. And that story is really what made me realize, there's so much more to the story of the golden toad that we haven't shared, that the local people know, that is not, public knowledge. And then you kind of get into the whole question of their decline and what caused that and the kind of competing theories. But it was that idea, well, if golden toads were out there in 1991 and nobody, including Eladio, has been back to this spot in about 30 years to look for golden toads, what if they're still out there? And that was something that when you combine that with these other local stories of frogs and toads that we had believed to be extinct in the tropics and beyond, starting to reemerge in little protected pockets, it really creates sort of a compelling idea that there is a hope that this species could still be out there somewhere.
So you decide, I'm going to find it.
That's what, 21-year-old Trevor, we're now in 2025. This would have been 2017 or 2018. That idea of, could I be the one to find this lost species? It's a little bit arrogant. I think it's a little bit, it's a little bit selfish, but that's what a 21-year-old thinks when they're romping around the cloud forest. But as we kind of worked on this story over the last like 10 years now, more or less, that idea sort of evolved. And I, learned about colonial science and things like that, and kind of the, the dark side of, honestly, people like me, white gringos from the United States, kind of coming into tropical ecosystems and saying, let me see what I can do in here. And so we really started to work really closely with local people, local NGOs, local people like Eladio who know that area super well, and local conservation organizations who are working to protect that land in collaboration with like local farmers and ranchers and things like that. And that idea became more complex, honestly, over time. And it kind of evolved from, I really want to find the golden toad, to what would it mean to find the golden toad? Is that a good thing? Is that a more complex thing? And have we learned enough in the last, 30 years from its last sighting to be able to protect it, help it if we were to find it again?
Well, explain that a little more. Like, what would it mean if we were to find it?
Yeah, there's a couple things. So I think the golden toad is sort of a poster child for extinction, and we've learned a lot from its extinction, having to do with the mechanisms of disease, which is one of the theories around its extinction. We've also learned a lot about climate change and how small changes in climate affect these really vulnerable ecosystems. Monteverde is a great example of this because it's like at the cusp of its existence. The golden toad lived at the top of this mountain. And so when climate conditions changed, it had nowhere left to go, couldn't climb the mountain any higher. I think we can draw a parallel between the golden toad and us in that regard. We're seeing climate impacts in these more vulnerable communities in different places in the world. But we've also, I think the loss of the golden toad had some positive impacts in a way. It sparked grassroots conservation ethic in Monteverde. There had been forest conservation happening in Monteverde before that, but the loss of the golden toad, I think, was one of those factors that really helped people realize how fragile these ecosystems were and how important it was to protect them, if not for the golden toad, then in its memory. Or if you believe that it's still out there, in order to give it a place to come back to. And so if we were to discover the golden toad again, on the one hand, that would be fantastic because it would demonstrate that these conservation approaches are having a really positive impact in Monteverde and elsewhere, and show that if you build it, they will come, they'll come back. But I also wonder from a, more ethereal standpoint, could we bear to lose the golden toad again? If it were to come back, do we have the tools in our arsenal? Do we know enough about this species and what it needs to be able to work together to protect it and keep it alive? Or would it be, almost a gold rush? A lost species comes back and it's this famous lost golden toad. Personally, I worry about what that means for Monteverde and the impact that would have on a global scale. And so, did we go out in search of the golden toad? Yes, we did. Did I necessarily want to find it and announce it to the world by the end of that search? I'm not so sure.
That makes a lot of sense. Other amphibians have come back, right?
Absolutely.
But they weren't so famous.
Absolutely. Not orange and not famous, but just as important and just as significant. So one of the species that we sort of accidentally encountered on our search for the golden toad is a species called Ismohyla angusta. It's a narrow-line tree frog. And biologists with the Monteverde Cloud Forest Reserve had seen this species here and there, but it was another species that declined rapidly in Monteverde with the decline of the golden toad, and it actually wasn't known to be in this area that we encountered it in. And so that was a really great example of a species that was thought to be gone from that area returning, recolonizing. And it shows you how much of these search for lost species things rely on luck and chance. I mean, this was a frog that Luis Solano, who is a ranger with the Children's Eternal Rainforest, just happened to spot on a leaf and pull out near a creek bed. And we ended up finding 2 more of them once we knew they were in the area, and we kind of knew to look for them. But we could have just as easily walked past that species. And that's not a species that spends most of its life underground and pops back up every, the first rains of the season. So that's one of those things that if you're inclined to look for hope for the golden toads, that could give you hope that these things are out there, but they're it's a big forest. It's not very well explored. And so these frogs are starting to return. Another cool example is Atelopus varius, a variable harlequin frog, which actually I was just back in Monteverde in March and was lucky enough to see some of these frogs, and they had declined at the same time as the golden toad. They were thought to be extinct in Costa Rica for a long time. They're starting to pop back up and reemerge. And the really, really cool thing about them is some of these populations that you encounter have frogs that test positive for the chytrid fungus, which was a contributing factor to the amphibian declines of the 80s and 90s. But they're demonstrating a resilience to that fungus, that pandemic that kind of swept through frogs and toads. And so I kind of look at it as they're doing their part. They're developing a natural resistance in some cases, in the fortunate cases, to these factors that drove them to the brink of extinction. And now it's kind of up to us to do our part. This population of variable harlequin frogs that I found, I didn't find them, I saw them. They're kind of isolated. It's like a sky island. They're doing really well in this one little patch of forest, but they're surrounded by pineapple fields. And so they have no connection to other populations, no genetic diversity. In order for that healthy population to have a future, we have to correct those corridors and connect that forest. And so it's kind of like really interesting to watch these frogs fighting as hard as they can against these factors that drove them to extinction, and kind of almost relying on us to step in and give them the last little push they need to survive.
So in the 80s and 90s, there was the chytrid fungus.
Correct, yep.
It came through and kind of swept through the entire world.
Yeah, it was pretty global.
and so that was this massive decline in amphibians everywhere.
So it's pretty well, documented and proven at this point that the chytrid fungus, which is this like pathogenic disease, was largely responsible for a lot of the global amphibian declines. However, for a long time, there was a lot of contention, and still is, around, was this fungus working on its own, or was it aided and abetted in its killing spree by a collaborator? And that collaborator would be climate change. And in Monteverde in particular, there's really good climate, weather, rain data around the ways that the climate was changing at the same time that the golden toad was declining, and at the same time that this chytrid fungus was sort of moving through these ecosystems. And I personally hold the view that I think it's unlikely that one killer could do this much damage by itself. And I think that the ways that climate enabled this killer, whether it's, helping it spread through different ecosystems, or if changes in climate are stressing amphibians and making them more susceptible to this fungal killer, I'm really interested in the ways that those climate dynamics and the mechanisms of disease can work together. And I think in Monteverde, it's a really clear case because you can see the climate changing, just from year to year.
What percentage of the world's amphibians disappeared during the 80s and 90s during this?
Oh, you're going to see. So this is why I had my co-author on this book, which is my brother Kyle. So I like to say between me and my brother Kyle, we know everything. And Kyle knows that one. So I have to call him on there.
That's okay.
It's a high percentage of amphibians. It's kind of not done working yet. I think it was in the Atlantic just a couple months ago. An article came out. It's like the amphibian crisis is not over yet. And so it's still something that biologists are working on understanding and responding to. And the frog stuff is scary. And what's also scary is this salamander pathogen called B-cell.
Talk about that, and talk about salamanders in South Carolina, which just astonished me for some reason. I had no idea.
Yeah, Kyle and I, my brother and I, grew up in South Carolina, upstate near the border of North Carolina, where there's all these great waterfalls and rivers and streams. And it's actually global hotspot of salamander biodiversity worldwide, which is super cool. And something that I think a lot of people in South Carolina don't know. I certainly didn't as I was growing up. You talk about a privileged upbringing. This was a privileged upbringing because I did not know the biodiversity of salamanders I was surrounded by. I thought it was like this everywhere, and then go other places in the world and you realize, oh, that was, a lot of salamanders right there in that one place. And so that was one of those things that I think of as super connected to my childhood and my experience and the way that I fell in love with nature and endangered species and imperiled species. And what's kind of scary is the idea that in different parts of the world, there's this fungus called bisal. Actually, the scientific name translates to the devourer of salamanders. It hasn't made landfall in the United States yet, as of right now, best of my knowledge, but it's something that is probably inevitable, that is going to make its way here and it's going to hit that salamander biodiversity hotspot before too much longer. And so we kind of have an opportunity to look back at these global amphibian declines, learn from them, and apply that knowledge to protect the salamanders of the United States before that salamander killer makes landfall. And some of that has to do with legislation, right? Like limiting the pet trade and shipping endangered species across the planet. Some of that has to do with like individual actions, like maybe clean your boots if you're moving between ecosystems and, making sure you're not tracking things around. And a lot of it has to do with forest protection and climate change mitigation. And so there's things that, you can say like, I don't know how I can help with this pet trade thing, but there are things that people can do to, whether it's supporting local NGOs in their backyard or doing climate change mitigation things from them. And then there's great organizations in the Southeast like Defenders of Wildlife, Amphibian Alliance that are working to safeguard those populations, make sure they have enough habitat to keep that, future genetic diversity together if and when this salamander killer makes landfall.
Where has it already made landfall, Bisal?
There's a cool example, kind of a depressing example, but an interesting example. In Amsterdam, there's this species called the fire salamander. They used to be really abundant. And then you're very similar to like the story of the golden toad, another amphibian crashes, just started to see numbers decline. And eventually scientists first thought, could this be like the chytrid fungus thing that's killing frogs and toads? And eventually discovered that it was similar to that, but a separate thing devoted solely to salamanders, evolved specifically to kind of wreak havoc in their populations. It's kind of popped up in a few other places in Europe, and we're kind of just holding our breath and trying to prepare as best we can to make sure that there's a plan to protect these species before it kind of comes for the salamanders of the Southeast that I grew up with.
Would the plan go as far as making certain areas like off limits, super protected?
Well, I think that's, I think thinking critically about what effects human impacts have on these areas.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a catch-22, right? Because I enjoyed all of these areas as a child, and it's what made me fall in love with nature. And so I certainly wouldn't want to put up fences and keep people out. But I think that's protecting the animals in their habitat is plan A. Plan B, and we kind of go into this in the book a little bit, is the idea of like captive breeding, protected populations in captivity. That's kind of like, it's almost your safe deposit box. We never want to rely on that, but it does sort of give us this backup plan. And there's an interesting story in the book toward the end of scientists actually, when they were able to predict the next place that the chytrid fungus was likely going to impact, sort of did a great frog evacuation and collected all sorts of frogs and toads from these Panamanian ecosystems to make sure that there were captive specimens in case captive breeding needed to happen, because they were so worried that this chytrid fungus was going to decimate those forests, which it eventually did reach those forests. And so I think, working on the ground and making sure that those habitats are protected is step one. And then we can start to think about those backup plans if it comes to that too. Which
are a real bummer. I interviewed a couple guys last week who are saving sunflower stars, which have all got wiped out in 2013, 14. Mm-hmm. And they're in the lab growing stars and hoping to be able to put them back in the ocean. This is where we are, right?
Yeah. That's the thing, is like, you don't want to rely on that, but it maybe makes you sleep a little bit better at night, if you know that you have that option. And some species take to that captive breeding better than others. And people have asked me about the golden toads. Like, why did nobody captive breed this species? And they're just a species that never really took very well to captivity. And it's not something that people just thought, oh, it's going to be there forever. But for some species that just doesn't work.
In the years that they were known to science, like the 60s to the end of the 80s, did scientists actually learn a lot about them, or was it everyone was just excited they were there?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's kind of ironic, like right as the golden toads were declining was when a sort of coterie of biologists was really starting to do some dedicated research on them. I mean, there's a handful of studies that happened in the 60s and 70s. Marty Crump, when she got there in the 80s, it was kind of like one of the biggest, most ambitious planned research projects on the golden toads, and it ended up being kind of an observation of their decline instead. So we found a handful of scientific articles that were written about the golden toads. Most of them ended in frustration, where like they're there at the wrong time and the toads aren't out. I think that, I heard a story of, somebody collecting toads and cutting open their stomachs to see what they ate. And then that was kind of all that they learned from those specimens. So we know a lot about the golden toads in terms of their behavior and their natural history. But I really feel like for all that we know, there's so much more that we don't know. And it's, I'd love to be able to go back in time and learn more about those species. But I'm not a research biologist. I think it's super interesting stuff, but I'm also kind of a little bit squeamish of disrupting like natural systems and ecosystems. And so personally, I'm okay with some of the mysteries that remain about the golden toads. I can let some of those mysteries live on without knowing everything about them.
Your book made me think so many things. One, it made me think, how many other species were there and are now gone, and we never knew they were there in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we just totally missed them. We definitely contributed to their extinction, but we didn't even know, like, right? Because the golden toad, unless you were there at that moment, most people would have never known they existed.
Absolutely. And I mean, they're this bright orange toad. We were lucky we saw them. There's so many other species that I think probably did go undescribed by science. And actually, there's a really great example of this in Monteverde. So I was talking about those variable harlequin frogs. Back in the 80s, it was believed that that species was also found in Monteverde. Today, we suspect that that was actually a totally unique species, a different kind of harlequin frog that had never been described by science. That frog disappeared in the 1980s along with the golden toad, and it's never reappeared in Monteverde. So that's actually a great example of this frog disappeared before we even had a name for it. Maybe
Right.
somebody had a name for it, indigenous folks in that area before we started writing down these histories, or Costa Rican farmers before the Quakers settled up there. Maybe they had a name for it. We don't know what that name was today. And so, that's an example of kind of these tragic outcomes of not knowing what species are there before they're gone. And so when you protect these big swaths of forest in Monteverde or waterfall ecosystems in southeastern, the United States, South Carolina, you're protecting the species that are there, but you're also protecting a bunch of species that you don't know are there, which is a really cool thing too.
Your book it's an adventure. It's beautiful. It's beautifully written. It's
Thank
a beautiful story, but it's also really, really sad.
Yeah.
Like it totally made me think so much about all we're losing right now. I talk to a lot of people who are working with endangered species or species on the brink. And it's usually conversations with a big sense of urgency. It's not already done yet. And so your book, it's like, oh my God, they're gone, which is a totally different feeling than the urgency feeling. It's like, we did this. I know they had the fungus, but we definitely contributed and have contributed to the loss of so many species. And so many more right now are on the brink.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance, I think, living in the modern world where so much information is at your fingertips and you can know what's going on in so many different places. And I think a lot of times we resist those emotions for survival because we don't want to live with so much grief and trauma. It was important to us to kind of reckon with that grief in the story of the golden toad and face up to it. Because the community of Monteverde has been feeling this grief. I think we could, get a little bit more ethereal and say the forest has been feeling this grief too, like the missing place that the golden toad once held. And so I think acknowledging that grief and living with it is an important thing to do. It's not something that we have to feel deep in our core every day, but it does, teach us something and give us something and give us some motivation to protect the species that are still there. I talked a little bit about sort of the evolution of my thoughts around the search for the golden toad, and they did change, and they have changed from, I think it's important to the world that we rediscover this species to show that grassroots conservation makes this impact. I've now kind of shifted that perspective to, I think it's important to learn from the loss of the golden toad, feel that grief, and really decide that we don't want to feel that grief again for this species or that species or all these other species that are still out there. And so the motive is the same, whether you think the golden toad is still out there and you want to protect the forest to give it a place to come back to, or you think the golden toad is gone, but we still need to protect these forests for all these other species that are still out there. They may not be orange, they may not be famous, but they're just as important and unique and vital to these ecosystems and cool in their own right that they're worth protecting.
You look for the golden toad like off and on for many, many years.
Yeah.
When you decided to call it quits, were you sad to give it up, or were you really ready to move on?
It really felt more like acceptance, sort of. I mean, I think you could probably go back and track the stages of grief probably that I went through. But I think if you do it right, you end up at acceptance. And that's where I ended up. And that's not to say that I've fully accepted the idea that the golden toad is extinct. Personally, I do still hold out hope that it could still be out there in those forests. But I have come to terms with the idea that it may not be. And I can live with that, and I can learn from that. And honestly, I think a lot of it kind of coincides with the birth of my daughter, who was born about 9 months ago, right as we were finishing writing this book. And so rather than spending the next 10 years of my life looking for the golden toad that may or may not still be out there, I really want to spend that time showing my daughter all of those frogs and toads that we still do have, and tell her those stories that my dad told me.
What a beautiful way to get to acceptance.
That'll do it for you. I recommend it to anybody who's trying to get there.
I love it. I love it. And I love this book. Trevor, thank you. Thank you so much for the book. Thank you so much for today and all of it. It really, your book changed me. It was a different, when I talk about like endangered species, extinction, but it was just this like beautiful sadness that you don't often come across in this world.
I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you so much for the kind words.
Trevor's book, The Golden Toad, was just released last week on June 17th. To learn more about Trevor and to read The Golden Toad, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knutson, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polkey-Link, Bethany Jones, Hannah Gabrielson, and Anna Kalner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.